Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, a production of The Commons, the online faith space created by the South Sound Methodist Co-op. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're also a bunch of people excited to watch movies and grow together through the lens of anti-racism. I'm your host, Lauren Fontanilla, and today I'm joined by Pastor Heather Sparkman from First Olympia. How are you today, Pastor Heather?
I'm good, Lauren. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
Fantastic. I'm so excited to talk about this movie today.
I had never seen it before. I'm wondering what your relation to the film is, but I'm more curious about your relationship to musicals in general.
So this was the first film that I saw in the theater after pandemic.
Okay.
Which I actually, in reading about this movie, discovered that was an experience that a number of people had.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, for me, a really joyful experience to be back in the theater and to have it be a musical. I love musicals, but nobody in my family does. So I went with my mom because nobody that lives in my house will go see them with me or watch them. My mom will, I don't know if she loves musicals, but she'll sit through them with me. So I actually love the musical format. It makes me want to dance. It makes me want to sing along. And oftentimes the songs stay in my head for days and weeks afterward.
Mm-hmm.
I find with musicals, I kind of get to relive the movie more than with regular movies because of that staying with me long past the time I'm out of the theater.
Yeah, I mean, I watched the movie last week in preparation for this. Before I sit down today and talk with you, I'm like, I don't want to watch the whole thing again. And so I've just listened to the soundtrack a couple times so that I have the plot like fresh in my mind. So it's like 1:00 on a Thursday and I've already listened to the movie twice.
I think with musicals, for me, there's a different kind of storytelling that can happen through that format as well.
Mm-hmm.
The songs can tell a part of the story, not just through the lyrics, but also through, the music that's with the lyrics. And so there's an added layer in the storytelling for me that I really love. And I'm okay with the little bit of suspension of disbelief that has to come when people are in a conversation and that conversation suddenly breaks into song.
Yes.
Or people are randomly dancing in the streets.
Yeah, there's a lot of dancing in the streets in this film.
Yes, the dancing feels to me in this movie particularly almost as important as the acting and the music,
Mm-hmm.
that it's another way that the story is being told throughout the movie. And I particularly loved that. Both visually, it's visually stunning and beautiful. And I also loved what the dancing was able to communicate as far as who the people who live in Washington Heights are. We'll probably talk about that a little bit more, about people who appear in the dance scenes and aren't other places in the movies.
Well, also the styles of dance that were represented too. I was doing some research on the production of the film, and the choreographers made it very clear that they wanted to represent many different styles of dance that people who would live in the community would be familiar with, and in different settings too, because the type of dancing that they're doing in like the pool scene is different than what they're doing in the club.
Yeah, I noticed that there's merengue, there's salsa, there's hip hop in there. There's probably some other styles of dance that I don't recognize that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
I also really loved, like, the pool scene, for example, how it has a nod to big musicals in the 50s that had, synchronized swimming.
Yes.
But it's updated with a style of music and dance that is current for today and would be reflective of the people who live in Washington Heights.
Yeah. I'm not sure we've actually said the name of the movie yet. So for those of you listening at home, the movie is In the Heights, which is an adaptation of the Broadway show of the same name.
And the pool scene, I think, was actually added for the movie. It wasn't in the Broadway play.
Yeah, I mean, how do you do that on a stage?
Right. The movies allow for some things the stage doesn't.
Yeah, the song is from the original production, but you're right that the location completely different.
Yeah.
So why was In the Heights chosen for the Anti-Racist Film Club viewing?
When I first saw In the Heights, I thought of it for Anti-Racist Film Club because it is a story about people who are not white, so people of color. I don't think there's a single white character in the movie, which is notable because even movies that center the stories of people of color often still have white people featured in the movie,
Mm-hmm.
and this one doesn't. And this tells this film looks at the Latinx diaspora. It tells a story about the American dream, but it tells it from multiple perspectives and it nuances that story. And
Hmm.
I think it's really important to have more than one narrative. And so to have a look at the American dream as it might relate to individuals and people coming from different places around the world, I think is really important.
Hmm.
This movie also tackles some issues that are really relevant in conversations around anti racism, like gentrification of neighborhoods,
Yes.
what people of color face when they try to maybe integrate into spaces that are normally white. One of the characters really struggles with how she's treated as a Latinx person going into white spaces. So there was a number of different aspects of this movie that I think are great topics for Anti-Racist Film Club.
Yeah, and I'm excited to discuss them with you. So let's hop right into a little description of the film. I've used little twice now in describing what we're doing. That's just a personal reflection. All right. In the Heights is a 2021 musical drama directed by John M. Chu, written by Chiara Alegria Hudes, and based on the original Broadway musical by both Hudes and Lin-Manuel Miranda. The film tells the interconnected story of one corner in Upper Manhattan's Washington Heights neighborhood through the lives of its residents over the course of a single summer. Characters like Usnavi, Vanessa, Nina, Benny, Sunny, and Abuela Claudia each attempt to reconcile their individual dreams with the desire to fight against the gentrification of their predominantly Latino neighborhood culture. But when everyone is pulled in so many different directions, it seems impossible to move forward while staying rooted in their shared past. Will Usnavi rebuild his father's bar in the Dominican Republic? Will Nina re-enroll at Stanford University? Will Vanessa move downtown to pursue her dreams of fashion design? And will one Paragua cart finally defeat Mr. Softy in the ongoing battle for cold summertime refreshment? During a summer of change, lottery tickets, scorching heat, and a fateful blackout, the young residents of Washington Heights learn to carve their place through both the big and small details to prove that they're not invisible on a disappearing block.
That captures it.
I had a really hard time writing the summary because it's a big story.
I know. I was thinking it's funny that you keep using the word little because this is a big movie, both in scope as far as like the stories it tackles, as well as like these big musical production numbers.
Yeah, definitely. So, where to start with our discussion?
Well, let's talk about the American dream and how we see it nuanced in this film. As somebody who is white and was largely brought up with stories that center white people, I was brought up with a single narrative about the American dream. And I think it's a narrative that a lot of white people hold as the truth. And that is that immigrants come to America. They've dreamed of coming to America. This is their final destination. Being here is the realization of all their dreams, and they want nothing more than to be American.
Hmm.
I'm not even sure that was a true narrative back when immigration to America largely came from European countries. But this film certainly looks at immigration and the American dream from a different lens and asks a lot of questions about where the American dream might fall short and what it might mean to be in America but still have dreams of your country of origin.
Hmm.
And I really appreciated the various nuances in the story. So we have Uznavi, who's really the main character, and he came to America when he was 8 years old from the Dominican Republic, and he really longs to go back. He wants to purchase the bar that his dad had in the Dominican Republic, and he thinks the best days of his life happened when he was in the Dominican Republic, and it's not until he returns there that he'll return to the best days of his life. And so it's almost a reverse narrative about the American dream, that coming to America wasn't his end goal. He
Hmm.
was brought as a child, it wasn't his choice. The hard work that he's putting in here in America to run the bodega he inherited from his parents is really with the goal of being able to return back to the Dominican Republic.
Which is something that I had never seen portrayed on film before, or a sentiment that I hadn't. And it does feel very counter to what the narrative that I also grew up hearing was.
Yeah, and I think it highlights that America is not always an easy place for immigrants or for people of color. Particularly, maybe for me as a white American, I tend to think of this as the promised land. Like everyone wants to come here and live here. And Usnavi's appreciation of the life he had back in the Dominican Republic is really beautiful. And it gave me a different perspective in thinking about what people lose when they immigrate, even if their goal is to live and stay in America, that there's still homesickness, a longing for what was back in maybe their country of origin, and that everyone has their own narrative and story. And so rather than me assuming I know, to be curious about people's experiences and how they might be different than what I expect them to be.
I think you get a lot of that in Abuela Claudia's song, Paciencia y Fe, where she describes a similar upbringing to Usnavi, where her mother immigrated from Cuba and brought her when she was a young child in order to look for work opportunities that weren't available to her in their home country. And she has a line about, like, not I don't remember the first half of it, but the second half of it is that it's like there's no something in New York and there's no food in Cuba.
There's no there's no songs of the birds.
Yes, yes. There's no bird song in it's probably not bird song. I don't remember. But the idea is that each version of home that she's experienced has something that she longs for and that she needs. And it's not as simple as wanting to come or go back.
Yeah, I thought Abuela again was another nuancing of the idea of the American dream. Where Isnavi, at least for most of the movie, is sure he wants to go back to the Dominican Republic. When he offers Abuela that opportunity to go to, not back to Cuba, but to go home to the Dominican Republic with him, she's a little conflicted, even though she has this deep nostalgia and longing for Cuba. And really, that song, in addition to her longing for Cuba that she expresses in her remembering it from her childhood, I think it also really speaks to her mother's life did not entirely get better by coming to America.
Hmm.
It did because they were able to have food and her mother found work, but it was hard work and it was work that left her hands scarred from cleaning fluids.
Hmm.
It was work that was maybe sometimes dehumanizing. And so having the ability to work and provide for her daughter was very important, but there was also this shadow side to it. And Abuela is really conflicted, I think, in that song about how the American dream was realized or not for her mother, and then maybe also for her.
Yeah, definitely. It's from this sentiment of remembering the life that her mother had that she first brings up the idea of the small details and claiming some amount of dignity in a world that wants to deprive you of it. And she tells this to Nina in reference to the hand sewn handkerchiefs that Nina's mother had created.
Right. And Abuela also remembers that her own mother had bought a pair of velvet gloves to hide her chapped hands, which were so chapped from the cleaning fluids and the work she did. But when she wore those gloves, it was that small detail that reclaimed her dignity. And I think that song and that story really put a face to so much of the immigrant labor that in America we tend to take for granted.
Hmm.
And I think, again, with that American dream narrative that says everyone just wants to come here and they want to stay here, I think sometimes that gives us permission to dehumanize immigrant labor because we can say, well, but this is what they want. And I think that Abuela's narrative and talking about her mom really calls us to ask a deeper question about the kind of dehumanizing labor that many immigrant communities do in America and the price that those people pay to do that labor. And if that really is that the American dream? Is that really anyone's dream?
Hmm.
I loved how Abuela remembers her mother and then also encourages Nina, a character who is struggling with the American dream in her own way, to find her own places of dignity as she's facing racism in her life.
Yeah, I think Nina's the character who faces the most overt racism, not within the plot of the actual story, but in her backstory, or her very recent backstory of dropping out of Stanford because of a racially insensitive encounter where she's accused of stealing from her roommate falsely, and no one believes her, presumably because she is not white in a school with a lot of white students.
Yeah, and I thought that Nina, as she tells her story throughout the movie, when she tells her dad about this incident that's happened to her at Stanford and how painful it was for her, her dad says to her, "This happens to all of us. We've all faced racism." And Nina so brilliantly points out the difference between facing it when she's alone at Stanford, one of very few people of color, and what it means to face it as a part of a community. She talks to her dad about what it means to live in this community of people of color in Washington Heights, where she sees people who look like her, who've shared her experiences, who she knows have her back. And so she really dives into how important the neighborhood is. And I think in this movie, the neighborhood, Washington Heights, is its own character. It's as important, really, as any of the characters in the story, the human characters. And Nina gets to that. Not that any kind of overt racism is okay, but that having people who understand you and are like family to you make the experience much different. And so when she was isolated at Stanford, it was as much the isolation from her community as it was the overt racism that really broke her heart.
And this is one of the changes from the stage adaptation to screen. I don't know how familiar you are with the original In the Heights 2008 production, but Nina's story is completely different. Well, I mean, it's not different in the sense that she still drops out of Stanford, but the reason in the stage show that she dropped out wasn't because of a racist encounter with a roommate. It was because her grades slipped. She lost her scholarship, so she could no longer afford to attend the school. And the reason her grade slipped was because she was so busy working enough jobs to pay for the rest of tuition.
Which again is another narrative about how the American dream can be so difficult and put so much burden on people. Her character, is smart enough to have gotten into Stanford. And there's tension in the movie, even though it's a little bit different plot line. We see that her dad has to sell his business, which is contributing, his selling of the business contributes to the gentrification of Washington Heights.
Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't want him to do that, but he has to do that in order to pay for her Stanford tuition.
Yes.
And so there's this real tension in the movie and the Broadway play around how people have access to resources. So even though Nina is smart enough to be in Stanford, does she really have access to Stanford if it costs so much for her to go, not just monetarily, but in the choices that need to be made for her to be able to attend?
Which is a plot line that's mirrored and even explicitly addressed with the flip side to Nina's college experience, which is Sonny's aspirations of college, where he is smart enough to do it. He wants to follow in Nina's footsteps and be the one who gets out, is the language that they use. And he wants to do it someday, but he is an undocumented immigrant. So even if he could get accepted into a school like Stanford on grades and that type of thing, he wouldn't have the access to scholarships in the first place that Nina has.
The scene in the movie where Sonny realizes that his undocumented status will mean he can't go to college is really poignant. And ironically, because this movie deals with dreams so much, that Uznavi, the main character, his whole narrative as he tells the story of the neighborhood is about dreams. Sonny is at a rally to advocate for dreamers, as they're called, to be able to have legal status in America.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at that rally that his own dream is crushed when he finds out, he hasn't realized until that moment, that because he's undocumented, he won't be able to get loans or scholarships or grants that might make his college dreams achievable. And so it's this point of of tension and heartbreak, that while he is advocating for dreamers to be able to stay in this country legally, his own dreams are dashed. And actually, at that moment, Nina reclaims her dreams as she begins to find some purpose that will make the cost of going to Stanford worth it to her.
Mm-hmm.
And not just the financial cost, but the emotional cost, as she decides that she wants to end up being a lawyer that will advocate for people like Sunny.
Yes, exactly. The other interesting part of Sonny's storyline, I was watching an interview with Lin-Manuel Miranda where he was talking about the way that other characters treat Sonny, who is the most, like, I want to say, like, he's a dreamer as an archetypal term of storytelling, where he really has aspirations not for himself but also the neighborhood, and he wants to improve his block and make life easier, better, whatever for everyone. And the way that other characters shut him down or say, like, oh, that's so cute that you think that you can make a difference. Particularly in the pool scene, he has a verse about all the things that he would use $96,000 to do. And the exact response from someone else is, you're adorable.
Yeah, it's interesting because that song, uh, 96,000, many of the characters, not everyone, but many of the characters talk about what they'll do with that money. Many of the narratives are consistent with what we would call a typical American dream. I'll use that money to somehow get ahead for myself. And Sonny, you're right, has his dream is really about the neighborhood and his people and how everyone can be lifted up through how he might invest that money. And Sunny is really the youngest of the main characters, and you're right, often experiences that ageism of being called, like, you're so cute. But in some ways, his focus on the neighborhood mirrors Abuela's, who's the oldest main character in the movie,
Mm-hmm.
because she has taken a similar role. Abuela doesn't have any children of her own, but she's the grandmother or the abuela to the whole neighborhood. She has really spent her life trying to make this community a better place for everyone who's in it. And so it's interesting to see how these two characters, in their own way, are focused more on the community even than on themselves. Another interesting thing, if looking at the actual history of the Washington Heights neighborhood, Washington Heights has the largest Dominican population outside of the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm.
It has long been a neighborhood that has had a large Latinx population, largely people who are in the Latinx diaspora. And in the 80s and 90s, Washington Heights actually suffered a lot of crime. And so it was a more dangerous and a rougher neighborhood. The people in the neighborhood were actually the ones who turned that community around and really pushed out the crime
Mm-hmm.
and made it a safer place to live. And as it became a safer place to live with less crime, that's when the gentrification began to happen.
Yes.
And so the very people who had been a part of making the neighborhood better for everyone who lived there, people like Abuela and Sunny, in gentrification are the people who are starting to be pushed out. And so gentrification can be a huge issue for any community going through it. But in Washington Heights, there's that extra pain of the community came together, the leaders in the community made this place to live better, and now they're the very ones who aren't going to be able to live there anymore.
Yeah, which is something we see a few different times in the film, but mostly with the Rosarios and Nina's father, Kevin, having to sell his business. Well, before the start of the film, he's already sold half of his business to the laundromat next door, I think they say it's like $8 for a T-shirt.
Yeah, and so there's that scene where Abuela goes in to have the napkins that are hand embroidered that she has talked to Nina about, because Nina's mother embroidered them, about that act of dignity and those little details. And they're having a big dinner to celebrate Nina coming home for the summer from college. And so Abuela takes them to the new dry cleaner to have them cleaned and pressed for the dinner. And it's going to cost, I think, $12 a napkin. So it will be over $100 for Abuela to be able to have all these napkins cleaned and pressed, which is more than she can afford. And so the dry cleaner that's now in Abuela's neighborhood is not affordable to her, who has been a longtime resident and has been such a strong part of this community for decades.
Yeah, I mean, even symbolically, the fact that it's the same napkins that we as an audience are meant to recognize that is the reclamation of dignity, having that be denied, but then also like appreciated in like a way where the laundromat, he doesn't like think that they're terrible napkins. He thinks they're beautiful, and he wants to buy them.
Yes, it's almost like that scene is an encapsulation of gentrification. Your neighborhood or your napkins are so beautiful and good that I want to, with my resources, I want to take them from you so I can have them.
Hmm.
Which is part of what's happening in the neighborhood, is that as the smaller locally owned businesses are selling because they can no longer afford the rent to stay in the neighborhood, other businesses with more money and resources are coming in, but that continues to price out the local businesses that have been there for decades. This is the story of gentrification. But it also means then that as the local businesses and residents are pushed out, they no longer have access to the community that they've built, which Nina in particular, her character, articulates how much this community means. That it's not just the loss of a place to live, it's a loss of relationships, it's a loss of support. And so I think that scene in the dry cleaner really is a microcosm of the pain that gentrification can bring into a community.
Yes.
It's interesting in all of the characters at the beginning of the movie, they are in different places about either wanting to get out of the neighborhood or come back into the neighborhood.
Hmm.
So you have Nina's character who's been away at school in California, and she is desperate to come back to the neighborhood and doesn't want her dad to sell the business, wants their family to stay located in this neighborhood. But you have in Uznavi's character, he wants to get out by going back to Dominican Republic. For him, it's not so much, I think, getting out of Washington Heights as it is leaving America to go back to his home country.
Yes.
And then you have Vanessa's character who wants to leave the neighborhood specifically and to go live in downtown New York, where she thinks is the best place for her to pursue a career she desires in fashion design. And so her narrative is all about how she can get out of Washington Heights to go to a place where she thinks she can achieve her dreams. She doesn't think that's possible in Washington Heights. And at the same time, Vanessa works for the neighborhood hair and nail salon. And that local business, which in many ways the movie sets up as kind of the heart of the community, it's where
Hmm.
you can come and get all the gossip.
Lots of gossip.
Yeah, lots of gossip. That business is being forced to move to the Bronx. And the owner of the business, Daniela, she doesn't really express regret about moving. She's more practical,
Hmm.
like this is what has to happen. But there's a scene where her customers are talking about how they're not going to go to the Bronx to still come to her salon, and she gets really mad, and she ends up comparing that to all of the hardships that her people have gone through,
Hmm.
including things like colonialism and slavery. And she says to her customers, you know, we've endured all of this and you can't get on the train to come visit my business in the Bronx. And
Which is
so,
3 subway stops away.
right, 3 subway stops away, like we've crossed oceans as slaves and had our lands taken from us, and you can't come 3 subway stops. And so even though she's very practical about the decision, I think the heartbreak of it really comes out when she talks about it that way, that she has to make this move, but it doesn't mean it's what she wants to do.
Hmm.
And she recognizes what's being lost. And so you have Vanessa who wants out of the neighborhood, and you have Daniela who's being forced out, but doesn't necessarily want to leave. And then you have Nina who is out, she's gotten out and wants to come back.
Which, I mean, there's some argument that she wants to come back to a place that no longer exists.
Right, because her dad's already sold half of the business to send her to her first year at Stanford, and in the course of the movie will sell the second half of it so that he can continue to keep her there. Right? So she has some nostalgia about a neighborhood that might not actually be there for her anymore. I think the lottery is a really interesting plot technique
Yes.
that is used in this movie. There is tension throughout the movie about who has access to resources and who doesn't. So that this is a working class neighborhood.
Yes.
We don't see poverty to the level of like homelessness or not able to eat. These people have houses, they have jobs, but they don't have excess resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that struggle like around Nina's family trying to send her to Stanford, or Sunny, the tension around paying for legal fees to try to get a legal status in America. So most of the characters in the movie play the lottery and they buy their tickets at Usnavi's bodega. And it really coincides with that idea of dreams, that maybe they're just buying the tickets to have a moment of dreaming about what could be.
Right, and that's expressed with Abuela, who buys tickets all the time, and ends up being the winner of the lottery in the end. But when she buys her tickets, that's the first time we hear the paciencia y fe, which means patience and faith, and that's sort of her philosophy. Not only if I have patience and faith will I win this lottery, I will survive in America.
Yes, there's a sense that surviving in America and even realizing something more than survival, moving to thriving and a realization of an American dream is so out of reach that the only way to do it is through winning the lottery.
Mm-hmm.
Which ends up happening. Abuela does win the lottery, although she's not the one who realizes the wealth from that. Again, coming back to Abuela, who's always trying to make life better for other people. But then the scene with the song 96,000, where everyone has these dreams about what you would do with this money, I think really highlights the working class nature of this neighborhood, that people are getting by, but maybe just barely. And 96,000 would represent opportunity that they just don't have otherwise.
Well, I think it's really interesting, and they pointed out that like $96,000 is a lot, but it's not that much.
I thought that was interesting too, right?
It's like so simultaneous. Like it's life changing money, but it's not like you could live the rest of your life off of it. I mean, comparatively, the Washington State Lottery this last summer was no, not the Washington. Sorry, it was Powerball and Mega Millions. Were up so high. It was something like $2 billion at one point that I was working at a convenience store and I was selling lottery tickets every single day, dozens of them, to people who was like, oh, I'll just throw my hat in. This is a chance. I never buy these, but this is like what like I might as well because like I'm just going to risk it. And I thought it was so interesting that like that's not the relationship that this community has. This is a community that regularly does it. And it's not because it's a pie in the sky number. It's because like this is the opportunity that they have, and they have that faith that maybe all the time. It's not just because oh, it's worth $2 because it could be 2 million or 2 billion.
Right. And that even though $96,000 isn't going to mean you don't have to work for the rest of your life, or that you can, buy a mansion, it could be life-changing money in this community. And the idea that, as Abuela's song illustrates, that on some level, on a daily basis, they're living with patience and faith, not just when they're buying the lottery tickets, but the patience and faith it took to immigrate to America, for the generation that immigrated, the patience and faith it takes to continue working towards a dream, even if it's very slowly. Like we see Usnavi has been longing to purchase his dad's bar back in the Dominican Republic for years. And so it's taken patience for that opportunity, to wait for that opportunity to come. Or we see in Nina's father that he couldn't realize all of his dreams. It turns out at some point he was not able to graduate from high school. His dad had pulled him out of high school in order to work in the fields. And so he has not been able to realize his dream of graduating from high school and maybe even college. But with patience and faith, he's been able to transfer that dream to his daughter, which there's tension around because she's inherited his dreams and is now shouldering that. But that narrative of patience and faith runs throughout the whole movie.
Well, even after the movie's over, when we learn that what the winnings are actually going to be used for practically is paying Sonny's legal fees, which they explain is going to be a multi-year process that might not even work and may make may negatively impact his life. And that will need to continue to have the patience and the faith that this will all work out. Like it's not a life fixing win. Like they invest the money in a future that's uncertain.
Right, which is part of what we see as the narrative of the Latinx diaspora, is that people have invested in a future that is unsure. Whether that is Nina's dad setting up this business and hoping that the next generation will be able to realize things he hasn't, or Uznavi inheriting the bodega and working there with the hope that someday he'll make it back to the Dominican Republic. We see that in Vanessa, who's a nail technician, but really has these dreams of being a fashion designer. And so she invests in moving to downtown with the hope of that uncertain future coming to reality. And we see also in her narrative, Vanessa is another place where we see the need to have patience and faith because she's turned down for her original rental application because she doesn't have anyone who can co-sign for her. And I guess I had said that there were no white people in the movie, which isn't true. I think in that scene, there's a white couple that comes in and meets with the rental agent after Vanessa does. And the rental agent has just turned Vanessa down because she doesn't have a co-signer. And the rental agent really condescendingly says to her, well, can't you get your parents to co-sign for you? They have to make 40 times the rent. That's
Oh
all.
my gosh.
As if that's no big deal. Then this white couple walks in and are treated completely different by the rental agent. And the way the scene is set up, obviously have access to what they need to be able to get into this rental. And so again, we see the patience and faith of investing in a future that might not come to pass. And along the way, the pain that goes along with that, where these characters in one way or another either face rejection or dehumanization or racism as obstacles towards their dream.
Yeah, I mean that's the first thing we learn about Vanessa, or the first word she speaks in the film is no, 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 no.
Right, that's the answer she hears all the time.
So, switching gears entirely from the plot, I don't know how aware you are about the controversy around the film's casting and the way it doesn't really represent the cultural makeup of Washington Heights, the real neighborhood.
So when I saw the movie, I have to admit that I didn't think about that at all. I just loved this movie. I was very aware that it was portraying people from different Caribbean nations. I think specifically, well, and other Latinx nations as well. It specifically, I think in the movie talks about the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Mexico.
Chile as well. I think Carla has family in Chile.
Oh, that's right. There's a scene where Carla talks about she's biracial from multiple ethnicities. And so she talks about, I think you're right, Chile is one of them. But I never thought about the color of the skin of the people I was seeing, besides that they were people of color. And I think as I read later about the controversy of colorism that surrounded the casting of this movie, I realized that's partially due to my white privilege, where I don't have to and don't think about representation in the same way that I would if I was a person of color. Because for me, I see myself represented all the time. So it's really normal for me to see myself represented. But that's not true, especially when we're talking about things like Hollywood movies for many people of color. And so the colorism in the casting is really noticeable and a point of pain to many Afro-Latinx people and people who are from Washington Heights. Pointed out that in the mix of the main characters, there is not representation of Afro-Latinx people who have darker skin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that the one main character who has darker skin is Benny, but he is not part of the Latino culture.
He's not Afro-Latinx.
I believe he's a black man.
Right. So he, even though we have a darker skinned character, he's not representative of people from the Latinx diaspora who would be of Afro Latinx ethnicity.
Which is significant because, like you said before, the largest Dominican population outside of the Dominican Republic lives in this neighborhood, which is in all of the advertising for the film, like seeing like, oh, this is the representation of the truth, and like this is what you never see on screen. Like we are going to show you what this neighborhood is really like. But then in casting so many lighter skinned people, it falls short of that promise.
And I've never been to Washington Heights, so I couldn't tell you what it looks like to walk down the street. But in reading people who are familiar with this neighborhood and with the community of this neighborhood, this movie that was set up to represent and tell the story of of Washington Heights and of the people who live there fell short of doing that by not actually depicting accurate representations of a very specific group of people, Afro-Latinx people who have darker skin, that are a huge makeup in that neighborhood.
And I think when I was first hearing about the controversy back when I was reading the articles when both the casting announcements were coming out and the trailers, I don't think I fully understood why colorism is such a problem. It was the first time I had ever heard that term in an academic sense or in a film criticism sense. After doing more research, I understand a little bit better. Would you be willing to give the audience a better definition of what colorism is?
Like I said, when I talked about not knowing about the controversy when I first saw this movie, I think, again, for me, having white privilege, I don't always think about the nuances of racism. And colorism is part of racism, and it's specifically preference for lighter skin in people of color versus darker skin. There is historical reasons why colorism has emerged. Often people of color with lighter skin have been able to pass, and so then they've had access to resources that the white community has access to all the time. So it has sometimes offered access to white privilege for people of color. It also, I think, often has to do with within a community, prejudices that emerge within the community. And sometimes we frame racism as if it's, white people only who are racist, and that's not an issue in communities of color. But racism can exist in any community.
Mm-hmm.
And colorism is one of the ways that that shows up. And so there is, as I read people from the Latinx community who were talking about this, it emerged that within the Latinx community, there is colorism, and there's often prejudice against people who have darker skin. And so I think as somebody who comes to this conversation with white privilege, for me, it helps me nuance and understand racism in America in a different way. But beyond that, I think it can invite us into having more recognition and noticing if we are seeing a depiction of a community that's really one dimensional,
Mm-hmm.
which the storylines of these people are not one dimensional.
No, not at
There's
all.
right, yeah, there's very nuanced stories, but the depiction of the people, the casting is pretty one dimensional. And I think I'll be looking for that in a different way after this. In a way that I haven't before, reading about this,
Mm-hmm.
the problem in this movie that emerges.
Yeah, one of the things that I had read, I think it was a New York Times article, quoted the director John M. Chu as having, when confronted with the controversy, said something along the lines of, "Well, we picked the best actors for the job." and the article was fighting against that sentiment as the way, like, he's using the language of the industry that has traditionally for almost 100 years said similar things in order to exclude all people of color from roles. And this form of colorism is just white supremacy with a different finish on it.
Right. And one of the questions that we have to ask is, why were these the right people for the roles?
Right, because I mean, inherent in that statement is that people with darker skin are worse actors.
Right, which cannot be true. We
No,
know
it's
that,
not.
right, to be a falsehood. And so were these the best people for the roles because their skin was lighter? And even I think if we ask a deeper question and really dive into how white supremacy plays a role in this, would the movie have felt less marketable to the people producing it if there had been more dark-skinned people?
Hmm.
Was this a decision about what would sell and what white audiences would show up to see? I think there was some talk too about even what Latinx audiences would show up to see. And so there's so much unconscious bias that we are exposed to all the time that we don't even realize it. So
Hmm.
I sat and watched the entire movie and never realized that I was seeing this one dimensional depiction of a community of color. And behind that one dimensional depiction, we really start to get into deep questions about how consumerism and capitalism works, what is marketable, how much people are willing to stretch themselves to experience something outside of their experience, biases that exist even within communities of color.
Hmm.
A lot of the conversation was centered on questioning the choice of Lin-Manuel Miranda and John Chu in their casting for this movie. And I think that they need to be held accountable. And another question that came up was, were there any Black people in any positions of power in the making of this movie who could have questioned the choices? And I think that's another great question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I watched a lot of interview clips, and from what I could tell, all the producers were white. The writer was a Latina woman. The lyricist composer is Lin-Manuel Miranda, so a Latino man. John M. Chu is an Asian man. And then, like, the director of art photography and, like, the production designer, costume designer were all white people. So I don't think I saw any Black identifying people in positions of power on the production of the film.
Right, which would have many people writing about this, many culture writers who wrote about this issue with this movie said if there had been a dark skinned person of color in a position of power, they could have spoken to this and perhaps stopped this from happening. But I think also we have to ask those questions of our society and our culture about, was this decision made to make this movie more marketable? And what does that mean about the American consumer?
Hmm.
How do we start changing that dynamic so that stories can be told authentically with representation of the people who those stories are highlighting? I also think that part of the controversy around the colorism in this movie is about representation. If
Hmm.
you have one movie in a year that comes out and is telling a Latinx story, there's a lot more importance put on who is playing the roles and what kind of representation is there. Versus if we lived in a culture where you had multiple stories coming out about diverse communities, then there's not as much pressure put on one movie or one book or one producer or one director because there's a multiplicity of stories being told. But because in Hollywood, in America, so many of the stories that are told center white people rather than centering people of color, the representation just isn't there. And it makes, when it's not done right or well in a movie that uplifts itself as a movie representing a particular neighborhood and community, it's even more painful.
Yeah, I think part of why It is such a problem for this film in particular, is that it is an adaptation of a work that is from 2008, which was a very different media market. Even if it wasn't a film back then, it was still breaking a lot of barriers on Broadway and setting a lot of precedents. And I almost feel like during the marketing of the film or somewhere along the production, they thought that just by adapting it, it was going to set new boundaries and break all the same barriers. But it didn't, because it's a different world.
There's some hope in that since 2008, the conversation has progressed, and we needed something different from this movie than was what was needed in 2008 when the Broadway play came out, right? That
Mm-hmm.
maybe our conversation about anti-racism and about representation and communities of color has evolved at least somewhat since 2008, and so that we're actually able to hold our filmmakers and our storytellers to a higher account and ask for more from them. And I think also we have a long way to go.
Yes, I feel like we say this during every single Anti-Racist Film Club meeting, but it's still true.
Right, that even though we know that this movie could have done better with its casting, also what I would love to see is just more movies about Latinx communities and Black communities and Asian communities, so that each individual movie doesn't have to try to do everything. And I don't say this to try to let the producers and directors off the hook for the colorism in this movie. We need to name it, and be honest about it and hold them to account as well. But I also want to hold myself to some account about the movies I choose to watch. Where am I putting my money? You know, am I buying books that are written by authors of color? Am I seeing movies that don't center white people? Am I seeking out and putting my resources towards depictions of diverse communities? And so I think that's an invitation for all of us to really think about the media we're consuming and who it represents and how the stories are told.
There is so much more that we could say about this film, but we've been talking for a while, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So I think this is a pretty good stopping point.
Sounds good. Plus, we still have to have stuff left to talk about
That's
at
true.
Anti-Racist Film Club.
If you listeners really want to contribute to the discussion, there's a whole meeting where you can do that.
we could hear your opinions. Come tell us what you think about the colorism in this
Exactly.
movie and about the casting decisions that were made, what your experience of the American dream is, and maybe how this movie might have invited you to see the American dream through a different lens.
Yeah. But for now, I'm just going to tell you to subscribe. So thank you for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast. If you haven't seen In the Heights yet, it's currently available to stream on HBO Max or to rent on sites like Amazon Prime or anywhere else that rents videos. I don't know if you can go to a Blockbuster. I think there might be one in Oregon, but that seems like quite a bit of a trip. To learn more about the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, visit funcoley.org or follow the links in our description below. This is a monthly podcast, so be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to, such as Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Music, so you don't miss our next upload. And feel free to share us with your friends, which is the number one way that you can help support this podcast and all that we do. But before we sign off, I want to thank you, Pastor Heather, for leading our conversation today.
Thank you, Lauren, for inviting me to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast.
Yes, those are all the words. But that's pretty much everything I have written down. So thanks for listening.